bit. I am Rebecca, and I'm here with Otto. I'm the field CTO at Swarmia, and Otto is the founder and CEO at Swarmia. And we wanted to just chat a little bit about some of the conversations that we're hearing in the as we're talking to industry leaders about this whole developer productivity thing. Um, we're definitely hearing that there's been such a change in how people are thinking about this and the pressure that people are feeling around this, and this ongoing do more with less in this new economic era. So, oh, one thing I wanted to talk about, this is kind of like we're just gonna have our one-on-one live here. So this is a lot of what I would actually talk to you about if we were having our one-on-one right now. um, but I had a conversation earlier this week with a former CTO about the challenges of setting realistic expectations with non-technical stakeholders when it comes to productivity.
Hmm.
Um, and so and so I am curious if you're hearing that too, but that it's not just a challenge of how do I make my teams be more productive, but also setting expectations with those senior leaders, or maybe non-technical leaders, to help them understand what developer productivity even means. So yeah, I'm curious if you're having some of those same conversations too.
Yeah, I think the problem has probably been there all the time that companies are just not very good at prioritizing, and especially people outside of engineering are not used to having to make those tough choices of what's actually important. And then when you combine this with cost cutting and potentially having a smaller organization and everything else, it's just more and more important to try to choose what actually matters. And so that really feels like one of the root causes. The other thing is that there's quite a few second order effects that happen after you kind of start changing this and increasing pressure and everything else. And I feel like most organizations are not really thinking about those either. So
Mhm.
those seem like a couple of themes that I'm hearing.
Yeah. One of the things too that I was talking to this person about was about how the company before he got there, the company had really hired for cost versus experience, and they were really running into the challenges that presents. Um, I know it's Formula. We've been really lucky. We have this this extremely talented and experienced engineering team. But what are you hearing about kind of how the people who were hired in the past are matching up to expectations of today?
Yeah, I think overall the talent market is just in a bit weird situation, and it's definitely tough out there for a bunch of people who have very relevant experience and still fail to land a gig at the especially at the salaries or kind of expectations that they had previously. And I think it's still healthy to try to always think about team building as a way to bring different kinds of talents together. And that just means that you want to have some kind of a mix of levels of experience as well, because the more senior people will enjoy being able to kind of mentor others, etc. And it just tends to be a healthier team that way. You also get to tap into a little bit different types of skill sets. Um, but and also I feel like focusing at cost too much on the hiring tends to be something that when you kind of observe the teams from the outside with this spreadsheet first mindset, you will miss out on the details of how valuable your most valuable engineers actually are, because turns out the people who actually know the stuff, who actually understand how your business works and how your code base works and everything else, they are extremely valuable. And so trying to save an extra 20% or even 50% from the cost at that point just might not be the right place to make those savings.
So how one of the things I've been thinking a lot, and I haven't figured out a way to say it nicely, so I haven't put it out on the internet exactly, but I do think when you're thinking about productivity, I mean, the hiring lower cost engineers is a great example where, maybe in the short term spreadsheet sense that makes sense, but in the long term not so much. Um, I feel like I'm also hearing from people in conversations I'm having about just the difficulty of setting these expectations with senior leaders and helping senior leaders understand how their actions are kind of impacting a team's ability to deliver. And I have this hypothesis that, we absolutely, there are improvements that people can make at the team level to how they're running their teams and how they're producing work, and we've talked about that a lot. What are the changes though that, and this is what I want to start poking at, is like, what are the changes that leaders can make? Because I think once you get through the, like, let's bring down our cycle time and let's limit our work in progress, you talk about that stuff, but a lot of the things that influence your work in progress or your cycle time come from outside. So what are you, like, how do you tell how do you tell the senior leaders, like, you're actually making this harder for us by constantly changing priorities or by constantly creating interrupt driven work?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing, and I don't think so. Unfortunately, many of the intuitive solutions to product development are exactly the opposite of what you should be doing. So anyone who approaches this from a more business mindset might think that, for example, higher utilization of people is a good thing so that people are busy. And then we know from the lean world and understanding the flow of work that when you're approaching 100% utilization of your teams, the cycle times shoot up and it's going to take forever to get anything done. And then if you're expecting it and the teams to be able to react to anything, that just gets more and more difficult. And so there's multiple patterns like that where you actually have to go against your intuition.
Mm,
And I feel like part of this is really just also educating the rest of the organization on this product development stuff, because if you are a sales leader or a people leader or something else, like, where would you learn this stuff? So if you are a product company at core, you should really pay attention to making sure that all of your leadership understand what does it mean to be a product company and how does one of our most important functions actually operate and what are the dynamics that we're dealing with. And for example, focusing a lot on the projects that we're delivering, that's of course one part of it, but everyone needs to understand that that's half of what engineering is doing. And then there is this whole, the old school term is software life cycle, but it's just an inherent part of what we do. And if you try to micro optimize that stuff from the outside, you are going to make very suboptimal decisions, because you're going to say that, okay, this thing matters more than whatever you were thinking of doing. And turns out that thing that the team was thinking of doing would be something that either keeps the service running or actually doubles our ability to ship more things as soon as next month. So
right.
many of these projects that engineering is thinking about, they actually pay themselves back relatively quickly, but few people are able to articulate that, and most people outside of the org just don't see what's going on there. So I would really try to figure out how can we teach more about our craft to the rest of the organization so that we can have more informed decisions and
Right.
higher quality discussions.
Right. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I kind of push back there because okay, sales and marketing, maybe nobody has ever told them how software engineering works. But if you're the CEO of a company whose primary task is to build software, I don't know, I guess sometimes I'm surprised that like you said, it's like your intuition leads you to absolutely the wrong place.
Mm.
Um, but maybe that's the message that I want to get out there, is just your intuition is going to lead you to assembly line solutions, and that's not the way that engineering works, you know?
Yeah, and when you're aware of the dynamics, you also become a bit more careful in how you communicate this. Like, I get a lot of ideas, and I'm a part of many customer discussions all the time, and I see all kinds of cool things that we should be doing. But I realize that when I'm bringing these ideas, I have a high likelihood of disrupting something even more important if I present this as something that's something that actually needs to get done now. So I usually preface my ideas with something like, this is not the new top priority, just a random thought from a discussion with X, and here's what we heard, etc. So understanding that dynamic is already a pretty big part of it, because it's great as a CEO to try to bring focus and try to kind of energize the team to work on the right things and bring context and so on. But you can also do it in a way that kind of just disrupts everything. And especially if you have something that the team already worked on that's 90% done, it's very likely that completing that thing is the most important thing. And
Mhm.
especially kind of canceling projects or shifting priorities in the middle of something is pretty difficult. But of course, this also has the engineering responsibility on the other side. Like if everything that you do takes forever, then of course everyone else is gonna become
Right.
anxious about how do you actually, like, what's next, when can we get to this other thing. And so that's another dynamic that makes things worse. Like if you're already doing like not so great in terms of your velocity, then you're going to be asked more and more things. There's also the typical example of now that I finally got something in the backlog, I'm going to try to include all of my asks in that, because I know that the next time someone's going to consider my feedback is maybe a year or 2 years from now. So that leads to another problem where batch sizes are getting bigger, and suddenly, again, things are taking longer and longer.
Patches are so interesting to me because I was playing around Claude the other day and just getting Claude to do some calculations and illustrations for me. And it's so interesting to me how like getting, and sorry, this is a little bit of a diversion from where we were, but hey, this is our one-on-one. It's so interesting to me how little change, like I don't know, certainly it's not always easy to make these sorts of changes, but little changes like making smaller changes and limiting work in progress and finishing what you start. And little changes like that can actually have tremendous, like mathematically tremendous impacts on your throughput and on your predictability.
Hmm.
Um, so that's another thing I just kind of want to figure out how to hammer home to people is that when you're to have a team that's working at 100% utilization or 120% utilization, that has like mathematically provable impacts on their predictability
Yeah.
and their ability to deliver.
And I feel like that's one of the areas where the industry's even gone to a worse direction in the past couple of
Mhm.
years, because and this always goes in these cycles where at some point it was all about agile, which is kind of
Right.
silly because the work management process is certainly one part of how you ship software, but I would give it a good 10% impact on kind of how you're doing overall. There's so many other things impacting it too. And then based on kind of how some of the top Silicon Valley companies operated, especially in this market where there was unlimited growth available, basically, and a lot of money available for these companies, everyone kind of became very impact focused, which is good. It's definitely a good thing. And that's kind of the foundation of modern product management and everything else. So it makes a lot of sense. And especially when you have an extremely high growth organization where there's a million things to improve to make the engine run better, that's a really great solution. But then it's a bit different environment than now, where you actually have to consider how do you do that without increasing the headcount all the time. And people just lost interest in understanding of batch sizes and kind of just
Mhm.
like, how does the delivery side actually work? How do we
Mhm.
really make sure that um, we continuously produce some value? And I mean, it has effects so far reaching, because ultimately, at some point when the pressure increases, and if your engineering organization is not delivering, you just can't say that it's ready when it's ready, and it might take an extra couple of years, and
Mhm.
we're
Mhm.
going to work on something that doesn't have any quantifiable
Mhm.
value related to it. So yeah, those foundations are definitely still very important, but I think it's healthy that we're not over indexing on agile and kind of not focusing on it too much, but there's some good learnings there.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Um, I'm also hearing a lot. Like I had a call with a woman. She's a vice president of engineering, and just she was saying like I've never had to. It has never been so urgent for me to communicate about this to my senior leaders. Um, and she was in the position where they wanted to dictate what the measurements were going to be.
Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, I'm curious, like I mean, I know I have my opinion, and you have your opinions, but I know that the board or the CEO, sometimes they just want to boil this down to one number, like are we doing well or not? And then they want to see that number move, of course. I know, you know, that it doesn't really work that way, but how are you advising those VPEs to go into the boardroom, or go to their CEO and talk about these topics?
Yeah, you kind of referenced it there already about, and I would say the main thing is being proactive because if you don't figure out how to communicate with the board and with the broader leadership group, then someone else will eventually ask you to do something. And usually they do that without the context of how engineering actually operates. And many of these measures and other tools, they have utility, especially within certain audience, and yet they become very even dangerous when you give the same tools for someone else who uses them without the context of
Hmm.
what's actually going on. So many of the useful tools that are at the team level, they make a lot of sense, but then if you look at them from the outside, you miss context. Like, well, this team was actually dealing with a production incident, and that's why we didn't work on this feature, and that's perfectly fine because that's exactly what we wanted to happen, etc. So that's one thing, being proactive, and it starts from doing this already when the times are good, because if you're kind of trying to salvage the situation during a crisis, when you never talk to your board about product, they
Hmm.
also lack all the context of how you're thinking about things and so on. So the right time to start that is now, and not sometime later when the board is starting to ask a lot of questions, because this also happened with a lot of companies that when the revenue growth is good, everyone kind of just assumes that things are
Hmm.
great with the product, and so we don't really have to focus on it, and our board meetings are going to be about some other topic. But then when the revenue growth stalls, then boards are starting to look for who's to blame, and eventually they are going to want to know how is engineering doing, and then often they want to talk about productivity, but they really don't have the right tools to talk about it. And I feel like most of the tools are really useful at the engineering level,
Hmm.
and they tend to be pretty dangerous at the board level. So um, you can talk more about what are you investing in. I think that's a good level of discussion at the board. Ultimately, it should be about investments and returns. That's kind of language that the boards understand. And frankly, I think many of the boards would find it very refreshing if you were able to facilitate a good discussion about that.
Yeah, I think it's that thing where these metrics that are so useful to the teams are actually very dangerous at the leadership level, or to share at the leadership level.
Hmm.
I lived that. I lived at a job where leadership got really, really focused on pull requests per developer per day as the metric for how productive the organization was being.
Yeah.
And they, I did not love that. And they also really didn't look at, like, are we working on the right things? I was just like, if there was a pull request, that must be good.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's another thing that gets missed when you break it down to these very simple delivery metrics that have become pretty industry standard. Um, that you're lacking, like you're missing that piece that should be very important to the senior leadership. You're missing that piece of what are we working on? How's it going? Is it the right thing to be working on? Are we spending the right amount of time working on this thing? Like, is
Hmm.
it okay that this has been going on for 6 months?
Yeah.
Like, is this still a good investment if it's going on for 6 months with 5 engineers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think those delivery metrics can be like they should be looked at in the context of that investment discussion, because ultimately to do something about it, it's going to be an investment that you make in some kind of infrastructure or automation or something else. So like obviously Dora metrics are the best known example of metrics to look at, and they might be helpful for benchmarking some things like how often are you deploying, are you breaking things while you're doing it, etc. And and yet there's many companies where you don't really have to look at that. And we just had a discussion about this internally, like why are we not looking at our Dora metrics from our product that we show there? And it's because we just don't have that problem.
Hmm.
It's about your DevOps maturity, and do you have a reasonably good process for CI/CD and continuously delivering to production.
Hmm.
And we deliver all of our changes to production right away. We
Hmm.
don't keep code in pull requests more than a day. We get it all out there all the time, and this engine just runs smoothly. And for us, we know that it's all automated. So looking at something like deployment frequency doesn't really help us in any way. There are subcomponents of this where some problems arise every once in a while. Like most likely, it's going to be at the code review time for us, which typically then signals something like we're not all so familiar with this part of the code base,
Hmm.
or we've kind of moved to this very individualistic working mode where everyone's working on their own thing and others are not so interested in it, etc. So it might reveal some team dynamics like that. But for our organization, benchmarking Dora metrics doesn't really do
Hmm.
anything. And
Hmm.
then for someone else who is in the middle of this transition, they might have a situation where they have a bunch of microservices that are continuously deployed, and then they have a monolithic code base that's causing a lot of issues. So at that point, looking for a template solution like Dora metrics doesn't make a lot of sense, because
Hmm.
if you aggregate this across the microservices and the monolith, you'll get some kind of a medium score, and you might think that, okay, I'm doing pretty well. But in fact, your problem is there in the monolith, and you should treat that as a problem you want to solve by investing in whether it's automated testing or deployment pipelines or some other element that makes it easier to iterate quickly with that code base.
Yeah. I think so. First, I want to note that we made it 22 minutes without saying the word Dora.
Hmm,
So good job.
that's great.
Or bad job. I don't know. It's probably good we didn't say it in the first 5 minutes. Um, but I also want to, kind of back to what we were talking about at the beginning. Like, we, and I, we're on a, podcast type thing. So of course we're saying that we do everything very well at Swarmia, and mostly we actually do. It's been really cool to see, like how mature the prod eng side of things has become in the time I've been here. And in order to limit work in progress, in order to do the things that bring those Dora metrics into a reasonable place, you have to limit work in progress, and you have to limit interruptions, and you have to have small batch sizes. And we've kind of created a culture where all of those things can happen. Again, plus or minus. I'm sure some people might say not that time. But we've created a culture where we can have that conversation of, if you make me do this, I won't be able to do this. And that conversation isn't necessarily safe to have in other environments. And so I think, again, going back to the top of the conversation, one of the things that I struggle with is how do you like, at some point it's not at the team level. Like, limiting work in progress is maybe not something that the team has control over. But if they aren't limiting work in progress, then it's going to show up in bad Dora metrics. So what advice do you
Hmm.
have maybe for a team that's in that situation where they know what they need to do, but it would be culturally challenging to do it?
Yeah, I think trying to, I mean, not everyone even has a chance of fixing this at their
Mm.
organization. If you are at an individual team, um, I would really just try to make sure that your VP or whoever is heading your organization at least understands how big of a problem this is for everyone,
Hmm.
because ultimately someone needs to push back to the CEO and everyone else that and kind of just agree that there are some fundamental principles of product development flow, and they apply to us, even though we'd like to think that we can all stretch just a little bit
Hmm.
more and get this one more thing done. And people need to see that it's actually what makes them get more stuff, because it feels like if we start one more thing, and this is again the business intuition speaking,
Hmm.
if we start one more thing, we're going to get one more thing. But in reality, when you start one more thing, you're going to slow everything down so that in aggregate, you're getting fewer valuable things from your engineering org. So that's kind of the uh, like dynamic that everyone needs to understand. And sometimes the CEOs don't get it. Sometimes, and you know, it's okay to run different kinds of companies and have different kinds of cultures. And sometimes in some industries, I'm sure that the winning organization is the one that just aggressively chases whatever opportunity is presented to
Hmm.
them, because there's such an important uh, kind of it's so valuable to have the right timing for everything or be the first to do something and so on. And it can be a pretty kind of working there might be pretty tedious at times, but it can also be pretty rewarding with the things that you're achieving. So I'm sure there's good examples of companies doing well despite of this.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to one yesterday that seems to be like they've been around for quite a while. They're still a reasonably small company, but they've been around quite a while and successful. And they don't have product. They, like engineering is also product, and they do really kind of celebrate and enjoy the interrupt driven, like a customer needs this, let's make it happen. Like it is very rewarding, and they aren't really shying away from that. And that was a really interesting
Mm.
conversation too, of like that's just how they have decided to work and it works for them. And they don't feel like they have productivity challenges
Yeah.
that are really pressing. So that was interesting too, to there, yeah, lots of different ways that people are running companies.
Yeah, many of those can also be stage dependent. So,
Mm.
for example, at Smartly, we were very heavily in that corner. So we were always about how do we bring in one customer and solve that one customer's problems, and then move on to the next
Mhm.
one. And it's a great way to make sure that you really react to customer feedback, because many product managers are going to overanalyze the customer feedback and say that we don't have the data to support building this yet, and let's wait for a bit more until we react to it. And if you can actually find a good set of customers, and they need to be representative of the rest of the market,
Mhm.
um, and if you keep solving their problems, that might be a great way to build the initial product. And we definitely applied that at Swarmia as well in the early days. Uh, we've had this concept of focus deals where we were
Mhm.
saying that at the company level, there are 3 deals we're all interested in, and everyone needs to know where they are, what their asks are, kind of how they are using the product, what their problem set is, and
Mhm.
so on. And that has informed many of the features that we built. And for some period of time, and especially when launching new product, that's my favorite way of operating. And then
Mhm.
at some point you realize that, okay, now we have 20 important deals in the
Mhm.
pipeline, and I would like to make sure that we're able to grow that to 50 for the next few quarters. And you also just want to make sure that you find the synergies, implementing stuff that actually benefits a high enough percentage of your customers and so on. So then the model just shifts, and making this shift tends to be difficult for companies because the early stages just feel so good when you're in this very
Mhm.
specific mode of working closely with customers and so on, and it becomes a very internal part of your culture. So making any kind of changes to that might be pretty difficult, but it's also just a necessity for scaling.
Right. It's interesting. I'm trying to think if this is true. So several jobs ago, I worked at a company that was very deal focused, and we would make engineering decisions based on like this customer needs this, this customer needs this. Um, But then I've also worked at places where there was no individual customer who was driving what we needed to build. It was, Stripe's a great example where, yes, eventually there were individual customers who wanted things from us, but at first it was like, here's an API, and if you use it to give us $1, like we're cool with that, right? Like it wasn't, there was no, multi-month sales process and no like signing a big contract back in the day. Now, of course, there are. Um, but it's just it's that's I think that's another interesting thing is when there are environments where things are really not customer driven. They are, or they're not so responsive to an individual customer.
Hmm.
um and I mean, I guess like maybe we get there at some point too, but the nature of our product is so different from the nature of a product like Stripe payments, right?
Sure.
You have to buy our thing and set it up, and it solves a more complex problem than Stripe's payments
Hmm.
API does. um but yeah, I'm curious how that kind of impacts. Maybe you can be more purely product focused in those sorts of environments and not have to be as reactive.
Yeah, but then again, I think with the reactivity too, you can make some informed choices at the company level that give teams a lot of focus and autonomy on making these decisions. And it comes from some principles on how you're going to be working with these customers, because very different, like different companies just have different expectations. So Linear, for example, the issue tracker, they're all about quality and the speed of the product and everything else. And so for them, it makes sense to spend a bunch of extra time making sure that every feature looks right and works fast and so on. And then some other companies just have other dynamics. So, for example, in our case, since we're kind of a data product that integrates with all kinds of different workflows, one of the fundamental things is that if we can't support your ways of working, the way you use Jira or GitHub or something else, then this product is not going to work for you. And a principle for us has been that if a customer has an issue with, for example, their Jira setup so that we can support it, we have to treat that as a bug and we have to fix it, because otherwise we're not going to get these customers on
Hmm.
board. And when teams know that, it doesn't have to go through some kind of a
Mm.
prioritization cycle or anything else. Teams just know that, okay, well, this is part of the deal. We just have to fix this, and it gets prioritized pretty quickly, and you can actually see that we got the change out the same day or the following day or something like that. So
Hmm.
um, and that's a strategic choice. You as a company decide what's important, and then you kind of push many of those smaller decisions to the team. Of course, the important thing is then to understand, this is where many companies go wrong. They don't have the feedback loop of, well, how is that actually working? Because you can also end up in a situation where your strategy is resulting in an organization that doesn't really get anything done anymore
Hmm.
because you're under resourced on the areas that where you would need to see some change. And
Hmm.
this also happens when companies do layoffs or something else. You suddenly have a smaller team, and maybe many of them are just spending all of their time just reacting to stuff, just trying to
Hmm.
keep the product up and running and so on. And then you're wondering, why don't we get some of the nice things that we have in our company objectives? And it's likely because the team just doesn't have the time to start working on that. And really, it's the right thing for them to do because they just cannot stop keeping the product running. That would sacrifice all of the existing revenue too. So that's not really an option.
Right. Let's talk about that, like that KTLO, keeping the lights on effort. I remember I first heard this term back in, I don't know, early 2010s, and it's become very popular these days, keeping the lights on. Again, what are you hearing from leaders about how much time they're having to spend on that and how they're explaining the necessity of it?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think might make sense to look at the leadership level and at the board level, because this is really about what are you able to invest in and how the systemic factors are affecting your team's ability to do the right thing. And so every time you take some shortcuts, take some technical depth, decide to ship a feature that requires some manual operation every time a customer wants to start using it, uh, you accumulate this new stream of reactive work. And what happens with a lot of companies is that since you're missing the feedback loop, you just keep doing that until you notice that nothing gets done. And so you've kind of reached the level of almost 100% going to just keeping the lights on. And I mean, that really happens, and that happens all the time. It can be a pretty local effect. So it can be that you actually have an organization where just some of the teams are dealing with this, and that's likely kind of where you are. But for example, in our teams, we're seeing about 20% of our time going to keeping the lights on, and then we're able to spend about 60% of our time on objectives and the new things. And it's the result of continuously figuring out where to invest and how to make our teams move faster. Because by nature, if you just keep increasing complexity and shipping more software, it's going to get slower. That's the default. So when you kind of just keep hiring more people and you expect better results, it might actually go the other way. And so you do need to pay attention to that, then always invest a little bit and fixing the
Yeah,
bottlenecks.
we talk about bending the curve, and how there is a curve. The cost of a unit of work is going to tend to increase exponentially as you grow and as your code base grows. And so how a lot of the work, especially at a larger company, is about flattening that curve and trying to get it, closer to, you add one engineer and you get one engineer worth of value out of it. But
Yeah,
it's really true that once you get up in the, in the tens, you're probably fine. But once you get up into the hundreds, you can really start to have a case where adding an engineer is not actually that additive. I think we saw a lot of that with the hypergrowth, of the 2010s and early 2020s, because where you had people who, yeah, companies were hiring so aggressively that the incremental value of each engineer got actually really low. Um,
sure.
and I don't, not that the engineer was bad, but that the value that they could create in the organization, just like the organization wasn't set up for that many new people to create that much new value all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. And that happens all the time. And this is also where it's kind of dangerous to rely on the metrics alone, because the metrics might tell you that, yes, the number of pull requests is going up,
Mm,
so we are getting something done. But it could be that you're just shipping the same feature over and over again. Like you could have solved this once and for all, but now every team is kind of doing their own version of this thing that should be a platform wide
right.
feature. Or then you're maybe rewriting the same thing over and over again, when different people are joining the team and they are wondering, why does it have to be this complex? And then there's always basically rewrite projects with no value add to the end customer being worked on. And this is, again, one of the dynamics that happens at many companies, that when you don't share knowledge enough, like you don't have people actually working together on stuff, then they don't understand why is it so hard? Why does this service needs to be so complex? And then when you look at it from the outside, it looks like it was probably those people's fault, and they're not here
Mm,
anymore. So
mm,
like it's very easy to blame them. And then what happens is that when you start the rewrite, you start seeing, oh yeah, there's a corner case that I
mhm.
had to take into account, and that leads to kind of just
Right.
reinventing the wheel for no particular reason.
I think there's stuff like that, but there's also, I remember starting a job, and like by day three, I think I was probably ready to cry because I still didn't have my development environment working.
Hmm.
And like getting it fixed meant like walking to another building and sitting down next to somebody, and and finally like being able to like, oh, the page finally loads 3 days after I started. And I continued to have, because we were all responsible for our own development environments. I continued to have challenges with my development environment, that because most people were developing on their Linux desktops, and I was a crazy person who wanted to use Mac. Um, And there were people who did that, but they were mostly managers. They weren't individual contributors. So anyway, yeah, I think that's a just the variability. We don't have a standard development environment at Swarmia. Like everybody owns their own. Um, we have code spaces if we want to go like really quick and hacky, do something. Um, but yeah, yeah, I know um, the companies I have worked for did not have that at one time, and now they do, and that's been a really powerful thing. But yeah, I think that
Yeah.
just the thinking
But
about. Go ahead. Sorry.
well, yeah, and I mean, we don't have standardized development environments, but we also don't have the problem. Like
Right.
we are hiring extremely slowly, and we are basically working on mostly a monolithic code base that has pretty good setup. So it's basically
Mhm.
npm install, and you're good to
You're good
go.
to go.
And so indeed, and yet, for example, at Smartly, we built extensive tooling for deploying all the microservices to a development Kubernetes cluster,
Mhm.
keeping them up to date, being able to take one of the services out and work on that, and while
Right.
connecting it to everything else that runs in the cloud. So eventually, that's a great investment, and I think that's the maybe even the main takeaway for many people here, that you should be really good at thinking about investments and making your case for why does it make sense to solve this problem. And historically, maybe we were more tech driven on some of those things. Maybe we couldn't quite articulate on um, like, does this actually make sense? Frankly, also sometimes people gravitate to interesting projects that actually don't have that
Don't have
value.
value.
So we also have to recognize that and watch out for it. But at the same time, many of these things, they did emerge from your engineering organization, and someone at the top likely told that just focus on the features. Can we just get
Mhm.
this thing done? And as a result, everyone's wasting their time with the build that's very unreliable and slow, or with the development environments that are extremely broken, or with
Mhm.
an automated testing setup where it's impossible to generate test data or something else. So most of the time, your developers will know the answer to that, but what you really want is just a high quality discussion of what problems are worth solving now,
Mhm.
and how much are we going to invest time and
And-
money into it.
Right. And what do you expect to get back? Like there are some investments that are worth putting three people on for a year, because you're going to get a ton of value out of that. Now, those three people better not just go off to a mountain for a year and come back and say, "Look what I made you." But there definitely are investments at certain scale and that are actually big but still important. And I want to echo what you said about like your developers know. Your developers know what problems they have. They may have ideas for what the solutions are, but that's different. But just really understanding those problems. At Stripe, we had a survey that we did that the actual timing of it is complicated, but basically we asked about a third of the engineering organization every quarter, and all of it twice a year. Just how do you feel about your productivity? And we had a selection of questions that we asked. I don't remember them, but the main that was the main one was like, how are the tools that you use affecting your productivity? And people could answer that. And I think, yeah, asking your developers what is getting in their way. I forget who I was talking to, but there can also just be some Stockholm syndrome of like, I just thought this was the way we do things. I just thought that I always had to click that button 5 times and wait 30 seconds in between each click.
Mm.
That's just what they told me when I showed up. Um, and where you have a team that maybe didn't feel like they had the agency to be making those sorts of prioritization decisions on their
Yeah,
own.
that definitely happens with a lot of organizations, that you have new joiners who actually have a lot of good ideas, but then they just face the difficulty of driving these improvements. And I think a part of the problem is that when there's no way to quantify the size of the problem, it's difficult to convince anyone else that as the new guy or kind of new hire, you should be able to drive this kind of an improvement project that's going to take so much time to
Right,
actually get done.
right. On the other hand, we at Stripe spent most of the year and most of the team converting the code base from Flow to TypeScript.
Mm.
And that was a really interesting one because we didn't really have an ROI case for it. It wasn't like this is, there was no straight line like we're going to spend this much time on this and therefore you will get um this much value, because the value was so squishy.
Hmm.
Value was so like, it was a retention play and it was a tooling play, and it was like, let's get on the same ecosystem that everyone else is so that we don't have to learn and fight as much as we have to learn and fight with Flow. um
Yeah,
and that was
we did that
it,
same transition at Smartly. So,
yeah.
I mean, these things definitely happen, and they can be really difficult to quantify. And I think there maybe sometimes you just have to think about reducing the complexity some way. And
Mhm,
if all of your developers have to know the tiny differences between Flow and TypeScript, and
mhm,
also run both sets of
right.
tooling and everything else, like that's just going to make everything more difficult. And if that's your biggest problem in terms of dealing with complexity, then maybe that's the one thing you need to address now. And I'm sure there are going to be others where
Yeah.
you can work on later.
um yeah, I just want to mention, like, sometimes there's stuff like, I think it was incredibly impactful because like people hated their job less, basically, and we were able to get rid of these 30 different versions of Flow that existed in the monolith. Um, and so, yeah, I think it's just interesting to think about how you quantify those kind of impacts of like, yeah, people hated their job less. People were really miserable working with Flow. Um,
Mm.
and it just wasn't the expectation that they had of a company like that.
Yeah.
Um,
It's also one of those things where it's just helpful to recognize the direction of the company and have an idea of where do we want engineering to go.
mm,
Because in many areas, if you have a direction and all the future work takes you to the right direction, then it's a pretty nice situation. But if you know that you're going to the wrong direction, for example, adopting more Flow
mm,
when in fact you kind of should be going to TypeScript, then that's just making it more and more difficult to later
right,
migrate to something
right,
like that. So sometimes there's just so much value in addressing the big problem sooner, even if you're not doing the whole conversion at once, but there's likely some kind of a baseline that you need to implement first so that everyone can then start working towards the right direction.